He is a CEO, board member, and advisor. He has over 30 years of leadership experience. Thrilled to welcome him. We're going to talk more about his experience on nonprofit boards and how they shaped his career. Terry, thank you so much for joining me here today. Terry, tell us a little bit about your background and your history and the work that you've done in your career.
Of course, Naomi, thank you for having me. Um, so yeah, across my career, I started my early career as a banker. I was a banker for 25 years, and as I think many people know, banks really encourage their officers to become involved in the community, and one principal way is serving on nonprofit boards. And in fact, the bank I worked for had a whole department. That's what they did, was place people on boards. And so relatively early in my career, I had a chance to serve on a number of nonprofit boards through that, a dance company, a theater company, both of which, incidentally, I was responsible as a board member for closing down, which is perhaps a different story for a different day, but it was because I was asking, I think, really relevant questions. But one of the more important boards where I developed a lot of skills and I had a lot of opportunity was the years I spent on the board of Kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope is a Chicago-based social services organization that takes care of children who are in the um, who are in the foster care system, essentially. And I was on that board from 1993 to 2016, placed there by the bank.
That's a long
I
time for a
was
nonprofit board.
Yeah, it was a long time. And at
Yeah.
times I couldn't figure out how I was going to get off the board. Um, but I was the first business person to go onto that board. Prior to that, they were all people from the social services community. And so in a way, I was a bit of a shock to them because I tried to come with a business mentality. But through my years there, I served as treasurer. I served as board president or chairman for over 10 years. And then I served as a general board member for a number of years. We had the founding executive director retire, and we had to replace him. So we did a search and replace him. Ultimately, his replacement actually got sick, came down with cancer, and so we had to replace
Yeah.
him. So I twice led the organization through the replacement of an executive director. We got a going concern opinion from our auditors in our early years. And so we had to go through some financial restructuring of the business. And then the other thing is, we dealt with kids these were at-risk youth. And so we had a couple significant crisis management that I ended up
Hmm.
having what was really an opportunity to help lead the organization through when we had some of our client children, they died while in our care. And so that was crisis management for the organization and the people because there was grief around it. There were law enforcement and regulatory investigations, and there was some, public press reaction. So we had to navigate around all of that crisis management. And what I found across those, 20 plus years is I had such an opportunity to lead across so many different kinds of things that didn't come up again in my professional career until almost 20 or 30 years later. And then when they did, I was that much better prepared because I had the opportunity and I got thrust into it. Now, this was a reasonably sizable organization. It was a budget of $10, $12 million with 120 employees. So it was a real business. And,
I mean,
there's,
yeah, I mean, it sounds like it. I mean, all of these things you're describing are the types of things you would do on any board, right? Like crisis management, CEO succession, right? And all of these,
yeah,
and then
right,
of course developing your leadership skills as well.
right. And recruiting and repopulating the board
Hmm.
a couple times while we were there. So it was very broad ranging for me. I was very fortunate to do that. Not to mention it was work and a mission that was very close to my heart.
And how do you choose the right board? You know, if there are people sort of listening thinking, well, I would love to be on a civic or community board, but how do I make the decision around which one is the right one?
Yeah. So some diligence, just as we would in anything else that we do. What my experience was, civic boards, they a lot of them can be very different. Some of them are not really functioning. It's kind of pay for play. You get a board seat because you write a check. And even some larger organizations are really like that as well. And then a lot of the smaller community organizations, they're looking for you there to raise money, not just write a check, but raise money, and set up chairs at the gala and so on. And then others have more substantial business operations. And so it took some diligence on my part to understand, who are the other board members, what's the mission that they're serving. I think if you're thinking about something civic, pick a mission that means something to you, that you have some connection to, because that's going to give you a little bit more passion and energy for doing it. Um, and then a piece of advice that I always try to give people is bring your business mind to the boardroom. And
Mm.
while you may say, well, yeah, of course. I can't tell you the number of times where you see organizations and you see who's on the board and they make really, really bad decisions. And you wonder, what happened to all these smart business people who are on the board? And I think it's because they don't necessarily take it as seriously. It's a nonprofit board and they don't want to upset the apple cart. And, I know on the various boards I was at, I did develop a reputation for asking the questions that were on my mind. And sometimes it wasn't appreciated, but you have a fiduciary duty when you're taking a board role, whether it's a for-profit, but especially I think when it's a non-for-profit. So do a lot of diligence, understand who the other board members are, just like you would with a corporate board, get to know the executive director a little bit, and what are they looking for in a board member, and do you offer that?
What types of questions? You talk about questions, right? And I think this is a really good point. I remember my first nonprofit board. I remember sitting in the room in probably the first or second meeting and listening to the questions that other people were asking.
Yeah.
And, they were really in depth. They were really probing, but they weren't aggressive or in any way, making the executive director or anyone look bad. How do you train? How do you get to a point where you're asking those really good questions? What in the board meetings?
I think in some ways it's how do we do that in our day-to-day jobs? It's similar. We have to not be as worried about, well, how is somebody going to feel? Which doesn't mean you're going to be rude or impolite in how you're asking the question. But if you have a question, generally you're not the only one who has the question if it's on your mind. So ask the question, and bring that sense of professionalism into the boardroom where I'm going to ask Naomi, I'm going to ask you a question, because here's a discrepancy that I saw. We are entitled to an answer. And it's maybe not that we're entitled to an answer. We should get the answer. That's our role. And that's the purpose of being there. You are a steward of the organization's resources, and you're not working for the executive director. As the board, you're working for all of the stakeholders, of which the executive director is certainly one of them. But I always thought that the mission should be about how do we make this organization better? And in doing so, sometimes you have to pull back the covers. You have to look under the rocks.
I like that. And you've obviously since then, since when you started, you're obviously very young when you started on nonprofit
Yes, I
boards,
was.
and I was too. I think I was about 28 years old when I got on my first
About
nonprofit.
right. Yeah.
You as well, yeah. It was a really, it was a huge experience for me, and it was very eye-opening in many, many different ways. You talked about obviously building leadership skills and obviously learning things
Yeah.
on the board. Is there anything
Yeah.
that was unusual that you learned during the process and that you're glad you did while you were on that nonprofit board?
Well, when I think especially about the Kaleidoscope board, when I joined, I was the first business person. So I was in the room with a bunch of social services people who looked at me and thought, well, I was there to cut the budget because that is sort of their world view. You
Well,
business
everyone liked
people,
you coming in the door, I'm sure.
yeah. And you're just here to cut the budget. And
Yeah.
we had a budget crisis and we got a going concern opinion from our auditors. And in many ways, though, it was the best thing that happened because it gave me an opportunity to explain to people, look, this is a business. We have 120 employees, we have a budget, we have raw material, which are kids and who are broken, and the finished good are kids who are fixed. And if we're going to be around for another 25 years, there are certain things that we have to do. And yes, I will cut budgets if that's the only way out. But there's another solution, which is raise revenue, right? So they have to be in balance. And and what was so informative, I think, was how I learned to and had to bridge that gap to communicate with these people and sort of meet them on their ground,
Right.
understand what their concern was. But I said earlier also about picking a charity or that you feel a cause for. I felt a particular cause for this because of my background. And I was able to leverage that in the discussion so that the people in the room knew that the work was important to me as a person, as an individual. But I also had, and we all had a responsibility to make sure that that work could go on. But so, and that was the first time I had dealt with, people of that nature in that kind of a relationship. And so I had to do a lot of learning and stretching along the way to understand their point of view.
And I think today there are so many different types of not-for-profit
Yeah.
organizations, right? You have, professional networks, you have clubs, golf clubs, right? You have industry associations, professional associations, and then you have obviously your standard charities, which I think we've been talking about. If you think about someone who's growing their career in a particular industry, do you think it's valuable for them to sit on an industry association board? And what kind of benefits do you think that has?
Yeah, I do. And as I think you know from my background, I've sat on a lot of those boards and I do now. Um, it is in addition to an opportunity to, develop some skills, you develop relationships with your fellow board members in a different way. And so I think particularly with the professional associations, I really encourage people get involved in the boards. Look, I moved to New York 3 years ago. I knew a few people in New York, not a lot. I joined a couple industry association boards for the explicit purpose that I wanted to deepen my New York network, in a different way. And it was helpful in doing so. I was welcomed in because I had prior experience, but it also really enabled me to get embedded in the community in a different way. I did that when I left Chicago and went to South Carolina, and I did it when I came here. So I strongly encourage people to do that. Um, you mentioned, like golf clubs and so on. I was also on the board of the University Club in Chicago, and one of the things I appreciated about that kind of a board was I got a chance to interact with people from a lot of other different disciplines.
Mm.
When I'm on the board of a financial services association, they're all people kind of from my
Right, they're all in your
ecosystem, right?
industry. Yeah, yeah.
But when I was on the university club board, it was lawyers and architects and
Anyway.
professors and
Mm.
some of the most interesting people I've met. And so that also just broadens your worldview, broadens your experience, gives you different context for dealing with people from different backgrounds, all of which I find helpful both as a board member. More importantly, Naomi, it's been immensely helpful for me as a CEO.
Mm. And I know we're coming up on time in a little bit here, but you talked about leadership roles, taking on leadership roles like
Yeah.
chairman roles, secretary roles, treasurer roles. How I mean, I don't think for a lot of boards it's that much more work. It's obviously a little bit more, but I think it depends on the board. But what would you advise people around the leadership roles on nonprofits and where is the benefit there?
Um, well, look, the benefit, a benefit is just the opportunity to practice the craft, right? To do that. I would certainly, going back to the diligence, make sure you understand what you are stepping into. The work that I did on the Kaleidoscope board, because of the many things, transitions we went through, at times I was working 20 to 30 hours a week at that. Especially when we had a crisis going on or we were replacing an executive director, there was some big lifts. So if you're going to take that kind of a leadership role, make sure you understand what the organization may be looking like over the next couple of years. What sort of challenges do they have that are coming up that you're going to have to help undertake? And those are great opportunities to learn. Look, when we did those, they had to replace the executive director twice. I learned so much about recruiting, and managing that recruitment process that has been so valuable to me. So I'm super glad I did it, but it was time consuming.
Well, if you were to give any final words of advice for maybe a listener who might be considering a community board to help really build their skills, build their career, what would be your best advice to them?
Again, find organizations that meet some of your goals, that speak to a something that's meaningful in your heart. Maybe you've had someone who's had a particular medical condition. There's always those kinds of organizations that get run for that. Or maybe it's the school board because your kids are in school. I would say start somewhere, start relatively small, so you put your toe in the water. But take it seriously and take that fiduciary obligation seriously. And if you step on a few toes of everybody who wants to be too nice in the room, that's probably okay, and it will serve you well in the long run.
Well, thank you, Terry. Thanks so much for joining me and for your contribution here today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Glad to
Thank
be here.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.